Hello, and welcome back to Heart Bar Books Presents Behind the Book. If you watched my first video, you know that I have acquired 1,400 books at a book estate sale, and they are right there behind me, just waiting to be processed. I'm going through those and creating my own collection or my own library of books, and then finding homes for those that won't go in that I'm not going to have in my collection. Now, in addition to this, because of my unreasonable love of books, I still go out to thrift stores and yard sales and look for books and see if I can't find a treasure for me. So the other day I was at a thrift store in a town nearby, and I came across a book, let me show you here, called Shakespeare Company. There's nothing special about this book. It's just a paperback book. It's not old, it's not vintage or anything, but it has Shakespeare in the title. I love Shakespeare. I can't always claim to love reading Shakespeare, but there's an allure to Shakespeare, and so I bought the book. Then later in the day, I was at a totally different thrift store, and I came across this really cool book. Yes, it is vintage, 1965 copyright, cool dust cover, the portable James Joyce. It also has a fun original price stamp, $1.45 in it. This felt like a treasure, and so I bought it. I took these books home, didn't think about it, and then later in the evening I sat down to look at them and discovered that Shakespeare Company is not about Shakespeare at all. So many of you may already know this story, but Shakespeare Company is the name, or was the name, of a famous bookstore in Paris. It opened in 1919 and ran through the German occupation of Paris. And it was run by a most interesting woman named Sylvia Beach. Now, Beach is just one of those individuals that led a crazy, interesting life. And she did it by doing exactly what she wanted to do, which was to run a bookstore. Originally, she wanted her bookstore to be in New York, but she couldn't afford New York. So she discovered she could afford Paris. Now, the reason that she would even think of Paris is that she had spent time in Paris with her family. Her father's employment had taken the family there, and she had returned several times either with her sister or on her own, and as a result she had friends in Paris. And it was with the help of one of these friends and her mom's small savings account, thanks Mom, that she was able to open an American bookstore in Paris. Now, one of the notable things that I discovered as I continued to read is that Sylvia was able to get James Joyce's Ulysses published during a time when book suppression in the US was keeping others from being able to do so. And as soon as I read that, I went, wait a minute. I just bought today, completely unaware, a book about how James Joyce got his most famous piece of literature published on the same day in a totally different thrift store, completely unaware, as where I had bought the portable James Joyce, which has excerpts of James Joyce's Ulysses. That just blew my mind. It made me feel like the universe is helping me find cool books, and I was delighted with that fun coincidence or happening. So even beyond that, I continued to read. And it was interesting to read about how Beach first met first met Joyce. And she was quite taken with him. She loved his literature, and so she was a little bit intimidated by him. And when she first met him, she talked about her initial thoughts and how she noted how graceful he looked, the 2 rings on his left hand, his dreadful fear of dogs, and then she noted the light of genius in his eyes. He had very poor vision, so he also wore very thick glasses. She really admired James Joyce's work. So these two became fast friends, with Joyce beginning to visit Shakespeare Company often. And it was as this friendship developed that Sylvia learned that Joyce had been unable to get Ulysses published. And so she offered to try and do that through her bookstore. And Joyce took her up on that offer. I don't think Beach had any idea what she was getting herself into, but she, to her credit, jumped into that publishing process and never quit Joyce. Joyce loved the finer things in life, and he was very generous, and as a result, he often outspent his means. And Sylvia was aware of this, but she did everything she could to keep him afloat, often at the brink of losing Shakespeare Company. It's likely that Joyce would have been able to get Ulysses published eventually, but Sylvia made it happen so much sooner and really at no financial benefit to herself. She did it for the love of the literature and the love for Joyce and his family. Beach rubbed elbows with so many famous, notable individuals of her time. Writers, singers, artists, composers. Notable people would just show up unannounced in her bookstore because they had heard about this bookstore from friends in America. And one of those notable, interesting individuals was Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway visited Shakespeare Company often, and on one of his earlier visits, he came to Sylvia and asked her for some help. He had had a bit of a quarrel with Gertrude Stein, who was a art collector and a famous writer of the time. She had kind of a prickly personality, and he had had a quarrel with her, and he wanted Sylvia to go with him to make this quarrel up. Now, I find this fascinating because Hemingway practically fought wars on his own, but Gertrude had him intimidated just enough that he wanted a little bit of help from Sylvia to buffer the situation. I find that just amazing. These women were really amazing. So Sylvia set that meeting up, went with Hemingway to the door, wished him luck, and went on her way. There are so many more interesting stories in the book about lots of different people. Hemingway declared himself Shakespeare Company's best customer. And there is a concluding story in the book that, for me, proves it. During the German occupation of Paris, Sylvia had to close her bookstore. And she even had to spend 6 months in an internment camp. And when she was released, she hid in a student hostel until it was safe enough for her to go back to her apartment with Adrian Moner. And when the war was supposed to have ended and the German troops were supposed to leave Paris, there were lingering snipers on the roof of several rooftops that made it impossible for people to be safe on the street. And Sylvia talked about how you just couldn't go out, and it was really, really a difficult time. So one day, a group of Jeeps rolls up in front of the apartment where Beach was living, and she heard a deep voice calling her name, and it was Hemingway. And she talks about how she ran down the stairs and out into the street, and Hemingway picked her up in a hug and swung her around as onlookers cheer. And the scene just makes me tear up every time I think about that beautiful occurrence. So she talks about this and how they took Hemingway up to their apartment, and he was in battle gear, and it had blood and dirt on it, and he carried his machine gun, and he sat in their apartment, and they talked and visited for a bit, and he asked for some soap, and Adrian gave him their last bar of soap. And then Hemingway asked, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" And Sylvia talked about the snipers on the roof and how difficult this was. And so Hemingway got up and got his group together, and they went to the rooftop, and Sylvia talked about how it was the last time that she heard gunfire on her street. and Hemingway liberated the Roo and then got in his Jeep and went on his way. And I think, in my mind, I believe that Hemingway was Shakespeare Company's best customer. I cried at the conclusion of this book for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it was very poignant, but I also knew I was going to miss these characters. I was going to miss reading about Sylvia and her interesting life. There are so many more cool stories in the book. You can find this book if you're interested in all the locations you would normally look to find a book. There's plenty of copies out there for you. I've also listed some related articles and videos that might be interesting to you in the description below. And I want to mention Dr. Joshua Coton and his work on the Shakespeare Company project at Princeton University. You can check out the webpage and learn how Beach's records, she had the bookstore and then the lending library. You can check out how these records are giving information about the reading habits of the patrons. Super interesting. I used a couple of pictures from Dr. Coton's article, Becoming a Member of the Shakespeare Company Lending Library, and I want to thank him. Super cool project. Check it out. If any of you are aware of present-day examples of where creative minds, writers, artists, musicians are coming together to collaborate and befriend each other, help each other out, I'd love to hear about it. Please leave me a comment. Until next time, we'll chat with you later.